Chapter 4 Language. The abrupt beginning of the phenomenology, in the medias res of the body's sensory certainties, is in many ways the same as the equally abrupt beginning of the logic in some absolute antithesis between being and nothingness, in which even more paradoxically the two are affirmed to be somehow the same. For everyone, bodily sense perception, leaving aside for the moment Hegel's careful distinction between sense certainty and perception, to which we will return in a moment, is the very privileged content of the now, of the absolute temporal present in which we live at all times, and to that degree it is being as such, before any distinctions between being and existence or any medieval or Heideggerian scruples about the difference between being and beings. Sense is thus the primordial experience, which precedes all others if it is not prior to them, and to argue that it is somehow not as immediate and as privileged as it so obviously seems is a gesture as perverse as the unmasking of being as nothingness. It is important to remember that consciousness is not at issue in this chapter, whose structure is thus very different from Descartes' opening move. The argument has little enough to do with consciousness and material being. Indeed, we scarcely even find a subject present here. With sense certainty we have somehow preceded the very formation of subjecthood or of personal identity or personal consciousness. We are in a mythic state of the world, that blooming, buzzing confusion as which William James identified the body's awakening, or the world before philosophy, and it is this confusion that can loosely be characterized as immediacy, as a kind of deafening absence of negativities or distinctions. Not even individuality, the present, singularity, are words that can characterize this state, which precedes all the differentiations on which those concepts will later on be founded. Indeed, the only phenomenon which can in any way be structurally placed in relationship to this sensory plenitude turns out, in one of Hegel's most striking and original moves, to be language itself. It is therefore necessary to say a word about Hegel's conception of language before proceeding, but in my opinion that word needs to be a negative rather than a positive one. Hegel certainly has a positive conception of language, most thoroughly formulated in his Philosophy of Mind, an encyclopedia volume which is something like his Anthropology and in which the nature and function of language is laid out very much in an Aristotelian spirit. Hegel was a great admirer of the de anima. This psychology is the least interesting or original area of Hegelian thought, and has very little to do with the very striking appearances of language in the Phenomenology, where this alleged faculty is used in what it is not anachronistic to call a deconstructive way. The closest the dialectic comes to a productive discussion of language is to be found, unsurprisingly, in its view of the latter in terms of externalization and internalization, but little enough of the interesting surprises the dialectic so often reserves for us is to be found in this particular approach. This is to say that, while language cannot be trusted to convey any adequate or positive account of the notion, or of truth and reality, whence the tortured sentences and figures through which Hegel is forced to attempt such accounts, it can much more pertinently be used as an index of error or contradiction. Language, in other words, is more revealing for what it cannot say than it is for what it does manage to say, and this will clearly also mark the kinship of this moment of Hegel, not only with contemporary theory, but also with modernism in literature, where failure is so often more significant than success, and where the limits of language become the paradigm for the limits of representation as such. But first we need to differentiate several distinct uses of language in this book, which are not necessarily unified by a concept. Language can indeed appear within a given historical moment, or shape, as a component of that moment or an event within it. This is the case with the role of counsel in feudalism, 307/374, the way in which the great barons serve emergent state power. Already here, however, language is an ambiguous and often treacherous element, for as state power, the absolute monarch, becomes central, the heroism of silent service becomes the heroism of flattery, 378/310, and the earlier useful speech turns into an empty name, the family name of the great nobles, reduced by Louis XIV to drones. Later on, as we proceed into the 18th century and the world of La Neveu de Rameau, flattery takes on a demonic appearance and acquires the power of an aggressive weapon, as the parasite Rameau recovers his centrality and his essentiality from his rich patron. But at this point language is still simply one element in a complex dialectic and has not pervaded, 393/323, the whole. Still, such historical contextualization is the moment for one of Hegel's more elaborate excursus, designed to anticipate the latter expansion and the more general identification of language with Bildung, translated culture, to come. This is the discussion of language as alienation, Entfremdung, 308/376, in a passage which anticipates most of Hegel's complex deployments of this unique phenomenon, but this alienation takes place solely in language, which here appears in its characteristic significance. In the world of ethical order, in law and command, and in the actual world, in counsel only, language has the essence for its content and is a form of that content, but here it has for its content the form itself, the form which language itself is, and is authoritative as language. It is the power of speech, as that which performs what has to be performed. For it is the real existence of the pure self as self, in speech, self-consciousness, qua independent separate individuality, comes as such into existence, so that it exists for others. Otherwise the I, this pure I, is non-existent, is not there. In every other expression it is immersed in a reality, and is in a shape from which it can withdraw itself. It is reflected back into itself from its action, as well as from its physiognomic expression, and dissociates itself from such an imperfect existence, in which there is always at once too much as too little, letting it remain behind lifeless. Language, however, contains it in its purity, it alone expresses the I itself. This real existence of the I is, qua real existence, an objectivity which has in it the true nature of the I. The T is this particular I, but equally the universal I. Its manifesting is also at once the externalization and vanishing of this particular I, and as a result the I remains in its universality. The I that utters itself is heard or perceived. It is an infection in which it has immediately passed into unity with those for whom it is a real existence, and is a universal self-consciousness. That it is perceived or heard means that its real existence dies away. This its otherness has been taken back into itself, and its real existence is just this, that as a self-conscious now, as a real existence, it is not a real existence, and through this vanishing it is a real existence. 308/309, Dies Entfremdung aber Geschichte allein in der Sprache, welche hier in ihrer Eigentum in Bedeutung auftritt dort, in der Welt der Sittlichkeit gesetzt und Würfel, in der Welt der Wirklichkeit erst rat, hat sie das Wissen zum Inhalt und ist dessen Form, hier aber erholt sie die Form, welche sie ist, selbst zum Inhalt und gilt als Sprache, es ist die Kraft des Sprechens als ein solchen, welch das ausführt, was auszufahren ist. Denn sie ist das Dasein des reinen Selbsts, als Selbsts, in ihr tritt die Charit W6 ein die Einzelheit des Selbst Beaufitseins als solch in die Existenz, so der sie veränder ist. ICH als dies reine ICH ist sonst nicht der Backslash in jeder anderen Auffassung ist es in ein Wirklichkeit versenkt und in einer Gestalt, AUS welche es sich so gesehen kann. Es ist AUS seine Handlung wie AUS seinem physiognomischen Ausdruck in sich reflektiert und laffet solches Anwohlstand ich Dasein, worin immer ben so viel als you and I ist, entzielt Legion. Die Sprache aber entfällt es in seiner Reinheit, sie allein spricht ICHAUS, es selbst. die zijn das ist els das Eingegenstandlichkeit, welch zijn ware nature en hat. ICH ist dieses ICH, aber ebenso allgemeiner, seine erschienen ist ebenso unmittelbar die Entofferung das Verschwinden dieses Ich zum dadurch sein Bleiben in seiner Allgemeinheit. ICH, das sich ausbricht, ist Phänomen, es ist ein Ansteckung, worin es unmittelbar in die Einheit mit dienen, für welch es ist, I bergigen und allgemein selbst beruft sein ist dort, dafür es Phänomen wird, darin ist sein das ihn selbst unmittelbar verhalb, die sein anders ein ist in sich so genommen, und eben dies ist sein das ihn, als selbst beruft /, wie es ist, nicht das Sein und durch dies Verschwinden das Sein. 376. The passage at first seems to be a rehearsal, in the specific register or thematics of language itself, of that more general dialectic of externalization and internalization to which we have already briefly referred, but one which expresses itself through an opposition of form and content, unlike many of the other discussions of externalization as work or production. Here counsel begins as the content of this new secular post-sacred world of modernity as Bildung or culture. The barons impart wisdom and good sense to the king. They lay out the situation for him and point out the consequences good and bad. In other words, their language has determinate content and is worth what the content is worth. With the shift in gravity characteristic of the emergent absolute monarchy, little by little it becomes the form of language, the fact of speaking to the king, of having the right to speak to the king, which outweighs anything specific to be said to him. This shift is more than the mere status change of a language of equals into a language of courtiers. It is a foregrounding of language itself as such, nor is this a mere degradation of language's function. For what emerges in the increasing differentiation of language as a medium in its own right, and the function of that medium as message in the atmosphere of the court, is also paradoxically an emergence of individuality as such. The paradox is that my individuality, expressed through the first person of language, does not really come into existence until it exists for others. We here discover a linguistic version of the dialectic of recognition that was hitherto visible only in the one-on-one hand-to-hand combat of the future master and the future slave. This simultaneity of the coming into being of my individuality and its being for others, for which now the fateful word universal will be pronounced, is however itself the moment of a second unexpectedly complex and paradoxical dialectic, one in which the wordless unique individuality of my private I will vanish behind the public I, the shifter that belongs to everyone and that is the bearer of my recognition, a kenosis, as Hegel will call it, in which the private is emptied out in order to make way for the public. Finally, we are given a glimpse of yet another peculiar development whose nature and consequences will only become apparent later on, and that is the characterization of this emergence of a public language, of what it is not premature to call the universal as well as the public sphere as an Ansteckung, an infection, something like the propagation of an odorless yet toxic gas through the atmosphere. We are perhaps still enough given over to the celebration of language and communication in the structuralist and post-structuralist period to be startled, if not shocked, by this unexpected figure, to which we will return, even though, from another perspective, it may be taken to anticipate a theory of the media. Other seemingly secondary instances of language as an element within a moment are also liable to this kind of philosophical reversal and enlargement. Thus H.P.'s occasional reliance on colloquialisms, the telltale French epithet of ispis, drawn from Rameau's nephew, or the untranslatable German expression die Sache selbst, the point, the main thing, the heart of the matter, focuses their secret philosophical content like a burning glass. Meanwhile, reified phrases, alleged laws or ethical maxims, are relentlessly scrutinized until they become pointless tautologies, differences which are no differences, while in yet another dialectical reversal already discussed above, the most reified skeleton of language as such, the logical proposition or syllogism, suddenly proves to be the very vehicle for life itself and the beating heart of the notion or begriff, the final stage of the Hegelian thought process. 24 We come at length to the most strategic use in the phenomenology of language as diagnostic method, and that is what we have characterized as a properly Hegelian deconstruction, and this is scarcely limited to its most famous instance, the disproof of the certainty of sense perception in Chapter 1. This striking demonstration can be seen as the radical incompatibility between the purest experiences of the body and its senses and the generalities of language as such. It is of course in some such way that modernism in the arts has waged a related campaign against the common sense assumptions of representation. But Hegel does not exactly interpret his own experiment in that way, contenting himself with observing that the accounts we give of sense perception do not say what they mean, do not say what they claim to say, or what they mean to say. Language, as we see, is more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say, and since the universal is the true content of sense certainty and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say, or to express in words, a sensuous being that we mean. 60/85, or, as he will add shortly, that we point at. The kinship with deconstruction here is to be found not so much in simple failure or incapacity as rather in the way in which language sets an intention which it is constitutively incapable of keeping. In other words, it declares its own standard, what it means to say, indeed, what it is actually saying, its veloidia, to use the Derridean phrase, and can therefore be measured internally by its failure to achieve the very standard it has set for itself and for which it has taken responsibility. This is why the opening of the phenomenology is much more than a mere gloss on shifters, that is to say, on words such as here, now and I, which purport to render immediacy while being so empty of content as to house any momentary referent for which they are used. They cannot mean what they say. It is certainly a striking rehearsal of that phenomenon, but the reversal has a methodological afterlife at many other crucial points in the phenomenology. Thus the crucial phrase returns, even though it is here not yet a question of language, in the master/slave dialectic, in which it is observed that the essential nature of lordship is the reverse of what it wants to be. 117/152. But the more powerful and satiric moments are those in which Hegel mocks the linguistic pretensions of empiricism on the one hand and laws of all kinds on the other. These represent the two equally futile poles of abstract reason, the attempt to turn the thinking about the observed outside world into a hard and fast fact and the attempt to formulate a generalization about the invisible processes alleged to stand behind the emergence of such observable facts. We see mere subjective imagining brought by the very nature of the fact to say, but unthinkingly, the opposite of what it affirms. 256/205 Here the fact in question is truly a thing in all senses of the word. It is the skull bone itself, which phrenology affirms to be the same as thinking, just as the neuroscientists of our own time affirm the raw meat of the brain to be consciousness. This particular scientific analysis gives rise indeed to one of Hegel's most famous and scathing aphorisms, spirit is a bone, 264/208. But the effort to formulate scientific laws is just as fraught linguistically, as we will have already learned in the chapter on force. Indeed, as we shall see shortly, anything purporting to substitute possibility or potentiality for being, anything attempting to substitute a beyond for a here and now, is the object of the most vigilant Hegelian critique, and this is in a way the obverse of the critique of immediacy, for it attempts to undermine relationship in the opposite way, not by holding fast to the appearance, but by holding fast to the essence, to what lies behind and within phenomena. At any rate, such laws have their own dialectic. They purport to be reified or dingfest formulations, but must always be accompanied by voluminous explanations. Infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement first clearly and freely shows itself. Appearance, or the play of forces, already displays it, but it is as explanation that it first freely stands forth. The reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction is just because in it consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself, enjoying only itself. Although it seems to be busy with something else, it is in fact occupied only with itself. 133-134/101. But it is with moral laws that Hegel will be sterner in his pronouncements. For it is the ethical law of the thought, the Kantian law of the Solian, preeminently just such a substitution of possibility for actuality, which is the fundamental target of Hegel's commitment to immanence. A whole nest of thoughtless contradictions he names the moral worldview, which affirms itself as a moral agent by virtue of having to become one, and argues for the validity of ethical law at the same time that it certifies its non-observance in the real world, a non-observance which had justified the necessity of its own existence in the first place. Two moments which are incompatible with each other and of which Hegel says, because a moment has no reality for it, it posits that very same moment as real, or, what comes to the same thing. In order to assert one moment as possessing being in itself, it asserts the opposite as the one that possesses being in itself. In so doing it confesses that, as a matter of fact, it is in earnest with neither of them. 453454/374. This insincere shuffling, this dissemblance will then be denounced from one end of the chapter on morality to the other as not taking the situation seriously. 454/375, not being in earnest with moral action. 456/377. But how can this be so, when we are dealing with so earnest a character as Kant himself, and what would it mean to take language itself seriously, when neither moralists nor scientists are able to do so? I think that their problem with language is twofold. On the one hand, none of them seems to realize that intention cannot be registered in language any more than sense perception can. What they mean, what they want to say or intend always fatally turns out to be the opposite of what they do say. They want language to express either the hard and fast fact or the beyond of appearance, while it can only convey the dialectical relationship between these opposites. This is, indeed, then the other face of the problem, an attempt to use language in such a way that it short-circuits the unity of opposites and attempts to enact the law of non-contradiction within a medium that is preeminently one of a ceaseless movement back and forth between antitheses. Indeed, the prime contradiction of all speaking is one of the most fundamental manifestations of that unity of opposites rightly held to be the essence of dialectical thinking, and yet, as the matter of language itself makes clear, so difficult to realize in a practical speaking situation in which words get disambiguated whether they like it or not. Indeed, Hegel's own complex stylistic strategies show how complicated it is dialectically to show off the antithetical meanings latent in words and thoughts, for what often look like tortuous or inarticulate sentences prove to be carefully planned performances in the systematic changing of linguistic valences. But this is only the most abstract way of characterizing the language problem in Hegel. The specific contradiction at stake here, from the first chapter onwards, is that between the individual speaker and the universality of language itself, and this is a tension which can scarcely be resolved. As we have seen, Hegel often dramatizes it as a sacrifice of the self, an emptying out, kenosis, an eclipse of individual subjectivity to the benefit of the universal of language. And to the degree to which Hegel understands his own position as a return to objectivity in the face of a rising tide of subjectivism, Jacobi, Schleiermacher, the Romantics, not to speak of the overestimation of the I in Fichte and Schelling, this surrender of the self no doubt often has a positive emphasis. Nor should we forget that universal here simply means other people, and that language is preeminently the medium in which other people are already present and precede our own individual appropriations, from childhood on. Language is thus already a symbolic apprenticeship of spirit as a collective reality beyond the individual, and even personal or private expression necessarily takes place within an already established collective framework and as a reaction against it. But this preponderance towards the object, as Adorno called it, should not be distorted into some caricature of asceticism and renunciation. We will see later on that the great word Befriedigung or satisfaction, one of Kojève's favorite Hegelianisms, betokens a whole ethic that shares nothing with the ideals of duty in Kant, let alone with the Platonic horror of the body, despite Hegel's idealism. Indeed, the phenomenology does reach a moment of equilibrium between the individual and language's universalism, and to see it as the result of this tension which runs throughout the book itself is also better to understand the otherwise peculiar moment with which the phenomenology ends, placing the narrative conclusion of the book before the religion section as I will shortly explain, namely the seemingly ethical climax on confession and forgiveness. But these are in fact very precisely grasped as specific linguistic phenomena, and as structurally unique moments in which a subjectivity is able to universalize itself and to receive recognition or collective acknowledgement. Something of this reconciliation can already be glimpsed in the description of conscience that precedes a conclusion whose narrative significance we will discuss later on, 480-1, 396-7. Whether the assurance of acting from a conviction of duty is true, whether what is done is actually a duty, these questions or doubts have no meaning when addressed to conscience. To ask whether the assurance is true would presuppose that the inner intention is different from the one put forward, i.e. that what the individual self wills can be separated from duty, from the will of the universal and pure consciousness. The latter would be put into words, but the former would be strictly the true motive of the action. But this distinction between the universal consciousness and the individual self is just what has been superseded, and the supersession of it is conscience. The self's immediate knowing that is certain of itself is law and duty. Its intention, through being its own intention, is what is right. All that is required is that it should know this, and should state its conviction that its knowing and willing are right. The declaration of this assurance in itself rids the form of its particularity, it thereby acknowledges the necessary universality of the self. In calling itself conscience, it calls itself pure knowledge of itself and pure abstract willing, i.e. it calls itself a universal knowing and willing which recognizes and acknowledges others, is the same as them, for they are just this pure self-knowing and willing, and which for that reason is also recognized and acknowledged by them. In the will of the self that is certain of itself, in his knowledge that the self is essential being, lies the essence of what is right. Therefore, whoever says he acts in such and such a way from conscience, speaks the truth, for his conscience is the self that knows and wills. But it is essential that he should say so, for this self must be at the same time the universal self. It is not universal in the content of the act, for this, on account of its specificity, is intrinsically an indifferent affair. It is in the form of the act that the universality lies. It is this form which is to be established as actual. It is the J which as such is actual in language, which declares itself to be the truth and just by so doing acknowledges all other selves and is acknowledged by them. 396 to 397, ab die Versicherung, a US Obergang von der Flit zu Handel, wo ist, ab es wirklich die Flit ist, was getten wird, dies Fragen oder Zweifel haben keinen Schingen das zu wissen dort, be jene Frage, ab die Versicherung wo ist, wie voraus gesetzt, der Fideinerie Absicht von der Wortgegebenen wird evidenziert, die H. der Fidas wollen des Einzelnen selbst sich von der Flit, von dem Willen des Allgemeinen und Reinen beübt seins trennen kann, der letzte wherein die Ried. Gillette, das ist ihr aber eigentlich die Wahrheit für der Handlung. Allein dieser Unterschied des Allgemeinen beübt seins und des Einzelnen selbst ist es eben, der sich oft haben, hat, dessen aufheben das zu wissen ist. Das unmittelbar Wissen des seiner Gewissen selbst ist gesetzt und flit, seine Absicht ist dadurch, dafür sie seine Absicht ist, das riegt, es wird nur erfordert, dafür es dies wiss, und dies, dafür es die Übergang davon, sein Wissen und Wollen sehr das riegt, sage. Das Aussprechen dieser Versicherung hätten sich selbst die Form seiner Besonderheit auf, es anerkennt darin die notwendige Allgemeinheit des Selbster, indem es sich Gewissen nennt es sich reines sich selbst Wissen und reines Abstrakts Wollen, DHS nimmt sich ein allgemeines Wissen und Wollen, das die anderen anerkennt, ein Gleich ist, denn sie seien eben dies reines sich Wissen und Wollen, und das deren Ort von einen anerkannt wird. In dem Wollen des seiner Gewissen selbst, in diesem Wissen, dafür das selbst das Wissen ist, liegt das Wissen des Richten dort, where also sagt, handelt so a US Gewissen, der Sprit war, denn sein Gewissen ist das Wissen die und Wollen die selbst. Wie dies aber wissentlich sagen, denn dies selbst ist aglich allgemein selbst sein. Dies ist es nicht in dem Inhalt der Handlung, denn dieser ist am seiner bestimmt Willen sich gleichgültig, sondern die Allgemeinheit liegt in der Form derselben. Dies Form ist es als wirklich zu setzen ist, sie ist das selbst, das als solches in der Sprache wirklich ist, sich als das vorausagt, eben darin als selbst anerkannt und von einen anerkannt wird. 480 to 481.